Welcome everybody. Looks like we've just opened up for AGIC and Australia's first feed grain webinar, alternative feed grain webinars into the Philippines for hogs. So we're due to kick off in 2 minutes. My name is Mary Rains. I'm market manager for barley for the Australian Export Grains Innovation Centre. So we've just got a couple of more minutes as registrations come through. Just bear with me again. My name is Mary Rains. I'm the barley marketing manager for AGIC, the Australian Export Grains Innovation Centre, and I will be your MC for today. As I said, this is the first time that AGIC, on behalf of the Australian Grains Innovation, on behalf of the Australian Grains Industry, has hosted this webinar specifically for the hog industry of the Philippines, using alternative Australian feed grains, focusing on wheat, barley and sorghum. Getting some background noise there. Liz, if you could go to mute, that would be great. Excellent. A couple of 2 minutes as registrations come through. Okay, it's 10:30, everybody. It's 10:30 in the Philippines and it's 10:30 somewhere in Australia, or past 10:30. My name is Mary Rains. I'm the Barley Markets Manager for the Australian Export Grains Innovation Centre, and I'm your MC for today's webinar. This is the first webinar that AGIC, on behalf of the Australian grains industry, has launched for alternative Australian feed grains into the Philippines. And we welcome everybody that has come in from the Philippines to join us today. We're actually really pleased. There's just under 100 people from the Philippines registered for today's event, and there's just over 30 people from Australia, Singapore, Thailand and Indonesia that have come online today. So listen, it's a really great number. We hope you, and we aim to give you a lot of technical information so you are able to optimise using Australian feed grains in your feed milling and feed nutrition aspects of the hog industry into the Philippines. So what I would like to do is also welcome to the Australian grains industry that have come online. We're glad to have the support of the Australian grains industry for this event. And we're also very supportive of Austrade, the Australian Trade and Investment Commission in the Philippines, that have assisted us in pulling this together. We've got Christopher Lim, who will be opening formally opening our webinar today. We've also got the support of the Philippine Association of Feed Millers here with Nikki Garcia. Thank you, Nikki, for your support. And we've also got the past president of the Philippine Society of Animal Nutrition that will be joining us today. One of our keynote speakers is our AGIC consultant for the swine industry is Tony Edwards. He's had over 45 years consulting across Asia, specifically for swine nutrition and swine health and swine feeds. And he'll be part of the panel session with Tony, Nikki and Ramal from the past president of the Feed Millers Association, and that will be led by our AGIC CEO, Mr. Richard Simonitis there. So just a little bit of housekeeping for today. If you're having IT issues when you're coming online to register, can you put that into the chat, and AGIC's IT people will be able to assist you with your IT issues. If you have any Q&As for today's panel, for today's webinar, can you put that into the Q&A section? We'd like, we want the panel to be very interactive, so do put in a lot of questions. So what you put in is what you get out. We've got some really expert panel members to be able to assist you and provide some insights into your questions. So also everybody will be kept on mute. You can choose to have your video opened or closed. Importantly, at the end of this webinar, there's going to be a poll. What we're really after is you to participate in the poll session. Why we want you to participate into the poll session is it's so that we can ensure that we are hitting the targets of the Philippine millers and feed nutrition industry, so that we can support you with the technical information now and for the future. We want to make sure that you gain value out of the Australian grains industry. Listen, we've been why we're doing today's webinar is that Philippines have been a really good grain trading partner for Australia for the last decade. So, you know, the last 30 years. We know that a lot of feed grains have been going into the Philippines over the last decades, and we're aware that barley is also going into the Philippines to be used as feed. So what we want out of today's webinar is to provide you with the technical support so you can optimize your value in using Australian barley in your hog rations, your swine rations, so that you can also gain value and optimize the value. So Australia here is to complement Philippines. We are here to complement you. We will never compete against you. Okay, with no further ado, I really look forward to today's session. It is the first time, and we're really thrilled with the amount of registrations. Now I'm going to hand over to Mr. Christopher Lim. Mr. Christopher Lim, he is with the Australian Trade and Investment Commission, and he's the Senior Trade Commissioner, and he's been recently appointed to his position as of last month to the Philippines. Even though you're based in Canberra, you're ready to you're ready to head to Manila as soon as possible once COVID's done. So anyway, with no further ado, Christopher, I'll hand over for you for the formal welcoming. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mary, for that warm introduction. Good morning, everyone. My name is Christopher Lim. I'm the newly appointed Senior Trade and Investment Commissioner at Austrade in Manila, which is, of course, within the Australian Embassy in Manila. So I'm delighted to welcome you to the Australian Feed Grains for Swine webinar for the Philippines. The Australian government and the Australian grains industry value our relationship with feed millers, feed nutritionists, and the enzymes industry in the Philippines. So my organization is Austrade, or the Australian Trade and Investment Commission. It is the Australian government's trade and investment promotion agency. We assist Australian companies to do business in international markets, attract investments into Australia, and promote Australia's education and training sector. This webinar is organized by our strategic partner, the Australian Export Grains Innovation Centre, AGIC, with a view to deepen our cooperation with the Philippines. So AGIC is an independent, not-for-profit company that supports international customers so that they get the most out of Australian grains by providing the latest information, technical support, and training. In the last 6 years, AGIC has been providing wheat technical trainings and information sessions to Philippine flour mills, bread and noodle manufacturers. As you're aware, Australia is a world leader in the production of high quality, safe and clean grain. Grown in one of the cleanest environments in the world, Australian grain is high quality, clean, versatile and reliable. Australian grain has long storage viability due to its low moisture and low mycotoxin contamination. So we are very much committed to supporting our grain customers by providing practical information about Australian grains so that you can take away and use them. I am sure that today's webinar will demonstrate that Australian grains such as barley, wheat, and sorghum are great options for animal feed diets in the Philippines. With this in mind, today's webinar will include an overview of the 2020-21 availability and production of Australian grains, including wheat, barley, and sorghum, insights into the benefits of incorporating these grains into swine diets, comparing their nutritional value and optimizing enzyme use, in addition to calculating shadow pricing for feed rations. Ladies and gentlemen, this year is the 75th anniversary of diplomatic relations between Australia and the Philippines. For 3/4 of a century, our bilateral relationship has gone from strength to strength. Australia is keen to advance our joint interests even further through cooperation and partnership. That is why the theme selected for this important year is Mateship and Bayanihan. I hope you can join us in strengthening this partnership through the mutually beneficial cooperation in this industry. Austrade and AGIC stand ready to assist. Thank you very much. Nariman Salamat.
Thank you very much, Christopher, for the the official welcoming of this webinar. And 75 years of partnership between the Philippines and Australia is very remarkable. Thank you. So we'll move forward into the rest of the presentation of the webinar. Up next is myself, Mary Rains, the Barley Market Managers from AGIC, and I'm going to give you an overview of the Australian grains industry. Just bear with me as I get the presentation up. So a little bit about myself. So my role with AGIC is to understand the market requirements for Australian barley into China and Southeast Asia. I'm based in Western Australia, in Perth, and I work to support the position of Australian barley at a national and an international level. Okay, thank you very much. So my presentation is about the production and availability of Australian alternative feed grains, wheat, barley and sorghum for hogs. Swines. Oops. So I'm going to give you an overview of my presentation. I'm going to give you an overview of who the Australian Export Grains Innovations Centre is. I'm going to talk about the landscape of the Australian grains industry and a touch on the production of the Australian grains industry for 2020-21, the year that just was. I'm going to talk a little bit about wheat, focus on barley and sorghum production in Australia, and also looking forward to the future of what the Australian season holds for us for 2021. So my key messages for this presentation is that in-market technical support is available from Australia to support customers of Australian grain and helps you optimise and gain full value out of purchasing Australian grain. In 2020-21, Australia produced over 51 million metric tonnes of grain. And what does the future look like for 2021? With our current La Nina conditions, we've had a lot of rainfall at the end of the season and also at the start of this year, 2021, which will set us up for ideal conditions into planting for this coming season. We also know that the Australian grains suit your market requirements in the Philippines, and barley is a highly functional grain for the hog feed rations. And Australia is engaged with the Philippine feed industry for hogs. So a little bit about the Australian Export Grains Innovation Centre. We are an independent, non-for-profit company. We're funded by the Australian government and the Australian grain growers. We were established in 2012 to increase the value in the Australian grains industry, both at a national level, but also at an international level to the customers of Australian grains. AGIC have facilities including research laboratories, pilot millings and pilot bakeries. Our head office is based in Perth on the west coast of Australia. We also have another large office, a technical office based in Sydney on the east coast. AGIC work across the main grain crops grown in Australia: wheat, barley, oats, to a lesser degree canola, pulses and sorghum. AGIC has a strong focus on collaboration, so we work to collaborate across the whole agencies in terms of grain grower representations, industry good companies, peak industry body companies, grain trading companies and government, both at a national level and also at an international level, again to people who countries that are purchasing Australian grain. So we work to have a strong collaboration so there's value for both countries. AGIC works to understand the technical and quality requirements of our grains for our customers, whether that be wheat for bread, wheat for noodles, wheat for cookies, could be oats for noodles and oats for rice, barley for beer, but here we are for barley for feed grains. AGIC also facilitates a lot of technical training, information exchange and in-market support. Prior to COVID, we facilitated a lot of in-market web conferences, but today we are doing it via webinars. Our technical training can be done and is done within one business or a collective of businesses with a technical expert. We also provide a lot of information of print material and also that talks about the Australian grains industry, the 2020-30 future of the Australian grains industry, different markets within the Australian grains industry. And we also have a lot of digital material available to customers of Australian grain. And most recently in 2020, AGIC launched on support with the Australian grains industry quarterly crop updates to give you insights into how the Australian grains industry is performing throughout the year so that you can forward plan for your businesses. Not only and then additionally, AGIC has research collaborations with commercial companies and universities, both so that everybody can work towards identifying how they can optimise their use with the Australian grain for a specific market and specific niche component of that market. So a little bit about the Australian grains industry for those in the Philippines that haven't been to Australia. I've just got a map up here of Australia, and the green area shaded in, the green and yellow area shaded in around Australia is where our winter crops are grown. Now, Australia is just under 4,000 kilometres east-west. We plant on average 23 million hectares of commercial grain crops annually. Of that, 12 million hectares is planted to wheat and 4 million hectares is planted to barley. And for those that are interested in sorghum, we plant just over 500,000 hectares of barley and sorghum annually. In Australia, our winter crops are wheat and barley, and sorghum is a summer crop. Australia has diverse soil conditions, climatic conditions, farming systems and markets, and all of those together do ensure that we do have a production system and a commodity that is available to suit our customers for their needs. I've just put up here on the red dots is where all the export ports are, where all the Australian grains is shipped out of. So the ports where grain is shipped out of. You'll note for those on the east coast, up in Queensland, the most furthest dot north, that is where the sorghum is exported out of. That's where a lot of the sorghum is grown, in that central, far north Queensland, central Queensland and northern New South Wales. So a little bit about the quality strengths of the Australian grain. As Christopher said, Australia produces some of the cleanest grain in the world. We work towards producing bright but dry, so a commodity less than 12%, which assists you in your storage of grain, 12% grain moisture, I should say, and we also produce some of the world's food-safe grain and some of the best feed-safe grain as well. We have a supply chain that is constantly regulating itself all the way from farm productions to export. The Australia has, for Philippines, has a very close market, so our proximity to market is very attractive between the Philippines and Australia. And as I said earlier, Australia produced country updates, accurate country updates with our crop reports, with our digital crop reports. We also supply technical support to customers of Australian grains through wheat, barley and oats, and to a lesser degree, pulses and canola. And Australia grains industry will continue to engage with the Philippine feed millers and nutrition industry, so they also gain value out of the Australian grain. Just to give you a little bit of a snapshot of the production of the Australian grains industry over the last 5 years, for those that aren't familiar, in 2016-17, Australia produced on record just over 56 million metric tonnes of grain. In 2018 and 19, Australia experienced a drought. In 2020-21, Australia produced over 51 million metric tonnes of grain. So it just gives you an indication of Australia's grain production capacity. When we look at the grains that are produced across Australia, our 5-year average, wheat's 52% of our production, barley is 24%, and sorghum is around 3% of our long-term production. This is knowledge that you may want to know when you are considering looking at barley from Australia for future business purposes. Now, this slide up here just gives you an indication of the Australian wheat production and its area since 1989 to 2021. The yellow bars is the area planted to wheat in 1,000 hectares. And then you also have the white line is the million metric tonnes of wheat produced in Australia. So from 1989 to 2021, on average, we plant around 12 million hectares of barley per annum. And you can see the yield on the white line. We produced in 2020 produced over 30 million metric tonnes of grain, and again in 2016 over 30 million metric tonnes of grain. So just an indication of the grain production of wheat in Australia. The next slide is focusing on barley. So we can see from the beginning, so for back in 1989 to 2020 that the area of barley has increased from on average 2 million hectares to around 4 million hectares of barley that is planted. This has come through advancements in breeding and genetics, also advancements in technology of farming systems. But if you're looking to buy barley for the future, for those that are already buying barley, this gives you an indication of the area of barley that's planted, on average around 4 million metric tonnes, and on average we produce around 9 million metric tonnes of barley. Australia is a net exporter of barley. We domestically only use around 3 million metric tonnes, so we will always be exporting around 6 million metric tonnes of barley a year. And for those that are interested in sorghum, we plant on average just over 500,000 hectares of sorghum, but in 2020, the season that's just gone, we've planted just under 600,000 hectares with an average of a production of 1.7 million metric tonnes. As I said, sorghum in Australia is a summer crop, so that is planted in September to November and harvested in November to January. And for those looking for the future of what does the Australian grains industry looks like in 2021, if I could buy barley now and I continue to buy barley, we just wanted to give you an indication that that we are set up for an ideal grain planting season for 2021, and that's come off the La Nina. So La Nina provided a lot of substantial rain at the end of 20. We've had a lot of substantial rain at the start of 2021. Australia is a rainfall dependent country, so we are dependent on rainfall for our crops. So with this La Nina, the outlook is above average with some dry conditions in the southern region. So my summary in my short presentation is that in-market technical engagement is available to support you to optimise the use of Australian grains. The 2021 season is very favourable. The start is very favourable. Australia will remain a stable market option for the Philippines as we are a net exporter of grain, particularly wheat and barley and sorghum. The Australian feed grains do suit your market requirements, and Australia complements the Philippine feed grains industry. And as I said, Australia is technically engaged to fully support the Philippine feed millers, nutrition and hog industry. And with that, I would like to thank you very much for your time in my quick presentation. If we could hold questions over, we might go into our next presenter. And our next presenter is AGIC's technical consultant for feed for swine, Mr. Tony Edwards. So Tony, as I said to you, has over 45 years experience in the livestock industry, in the research industry of livestock and nutritional industry. Tony has consulted widely throughout Asia, Japan, Korea, China, Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, India, Indonesia and Pakistan. Tony, you've been everywhere for companies such as DSMN, and he currently delivers 5-day international courses in pig nutrition and management for the Progress Group out of Ketastat Universities, Thailand, and regularly contributes to the Pig Feed Quality Conference run by Asian Agribusiness Media Pty Ltd. So with no further ado, I'd like to introduce Tony Edwards to provide you with an update and insights into the technical components of barley, wheat and sorghum as an alternative feed grain for the pig diet in Asia. Thanks, Tony. Tony, you'll just have to unmute yourself.
There you go. Thank you. Thank you, Mary. Good morning, everybody. Pleasure to be here. I might just go back one slide here, just to give you the title of what we're doing. If it will move for me. There we go. Thank you. Right, so as Mary mentioned, my name's Tony Edwards. I'm an animal nutritionist here in Australia. My company sort of controls the pig nutrition of about 1/3 of Australia's pigs, and we have a wide engagement across most of Southeast Asia. So we have quite an interest in rearing pigs. Today, I'm going to talk to you about barley, wheat and sorghum from Australia as alternative grains in pig diets and explore the options for what value they represent. But before I sort of launch into the detail of the talk, I'd just like to cover a few key messages, and I think if we keep these in perspective, it will help us appreciate some of the detail further on. And basically that is that pig production is very competitive and cost sensitive industry. Feed is the single biggest cost that we need to consider, and we certainly need to be flexible about regarding what ingredients we use to make those feeds. Pigs are adaptable and can meet their nutrient requirements from a broad range of feeds. I'm sort of never cease to be amazed at what we can use in pig feeds and get a very good result. Certainly corn and soy are not essential for pig diets. They are probably the most commonly fed ingredients, but they are not essential. We can grow pigs very successfully with other materials. And here in Australia, pigs use mainly things like barley, wheat, legumes and canola meal, and we get excellent performance results equal to any other areas of the world. Australia will this year produce around 12 million metric tonnes of barley, as Mary mentioned, and that is a fantastic crop. It's been a wonderful season. The quality of that grain is outstanding. And this Australian barley is both accessible and attractively priced for consumers in the Asian region. If we look at the world grain production, just in overview, you can see that it's dominated by corn, and secondly then by wheat, followed by rice, and finally in the fourth position is barley, and sorghum coming in fifth position. These grains are used for all sorts of different purposes, primarily human food and brewing and distilling, animal feed, and more recently ethanol production. Although the barley proportion there looks relatively modest compared to corn, it does play a big role in servicing the brewing and distilling industry, and a significant proportion of that barley is used very successfully for livestock production. Just looking at where Australia sits in terms of its grain production and export activities, the columns on the left-hand side refer to wheat, and you can see if you look at those charts there that the primary producers of wheat in the world are countries like China and the EU and India. China and India don't export very much of that material. They tend to consume most of themselves. But then we come down to other countries like Russia and the US, Canada, and then Australia. And these countries are major exporters of wheat in the world. On the right-hand side, we have the barley figures, and we see here now again Europe dominating the barley scene. Barley is very commonly used in livestock production throughout Europe, and also Russia, and then Australia is third on the list here. But in terms of their export activities, they're all reasonably similar, with Australia playing a fairly prominent role here in the world trade in export barley. In terms of the crop here in Australia in this coming or current year, as Mary mentioned, it's the second to record year that we've had 51 million tonnes of grain being grown. And you can see here that it's dominated by wheat, followed by barley. Also, other characteristics here is we have a whole broad spectrum of different grains that we utilise, and similarly a broad spectrum of legumes that are very valuable as feed resources for livestock. On the oilseed front, canola is our dominant oilseed, and we make very good use of that. But the characteristic of this profile that is quite different to other parts of the world is we grow very little soybeans and very little corn. And so we've learned to live very successfully with the minimum use of soybeans or corn in the pig industry. What is characteristic of the Australian stock feed industry is the broad spectrum of feed materials we're prepared to use. And some feed mills might include 20 or 30 of these materials at any one time. And you can see here, in terms of the cereals we use, there's wheat and barley, oats, sorghum, triticale, corn, rye and rice. And we use many different legumes here in lupins and peas and faba beans, etc. We use a lot of animal protein. There's a large cattle and sheep industry in Australia, and hence a lot of meat meal, blood meal, tallow, etc. available for stock feed purposes. But we do use a significant vegetable protein contribution as well, predominantly canola meal, as I mentioned, but certainly many of these others are included as well. And a useful profile of milling offals from various wheat, legume or maize milling operations. We use the full spectrum of synthetic amino acids as well as to balance all these variable components here to maintain we get consistent performance from our livestock. And we make very good use of the food industry byproducts that are available to us as well. So we're very flexible, very adaptable, and the secret to success here is having an intimate knowledge of the actual food value of each of these materials and how we can move from one to another and still maintain consistent performance in the livestock. If we have a look at the comparative analyses of the various grains on offer, it helps to put things like wheat and barley in perspective relative to corn. What we generally find is that wheat and barley are higher in protein than corn, but tend to be lower in fat. What distinguishes barley away from the other grains is this fibre component down here. They tend to be high in fibre due to the fact that they do have a hull attached to the seed. That high fibre in turn results in a lower starch content, and that's no major drama as long as we express or understand that difference and use the material accordingly. So whether or not we're using energy descriptors such as digestible energy, metabolizable energy, or net energy down here, and whether we express it in terms of megajoules or kilocalories, all we need to know is that there are relative differences between these materials, and as long as we're cognizant of those differences, we can use them largely interchangeably very successfully. I might add that these values are typical values only, and that the composition can vary widely with different agronomic conditions. In terms of the amino acids within the protein, there are some rather significant differences here as well. And this is the profile of what we call standard ileal digestible amino acids, the main essential amino acids that we formulate for in pig diets. And these are the values relating to typical protein contents of corn, barley, wheat, and sorghum. And you can see in the quick comparison here that in terms of these essential amino acids, barley generally has significantly more of these than does corn. And as a consequence of that, when we're formulating diets on barley, we tend to therefore have a lesser requirement for soybean meal or any other protein source to make it up, because we're getting a very substantial contribution from the barley grain itself. But we have to be aware of the fact that not all grain is constant, and a lot of effort has been put in Australia with a collaborative effort between the poultry or broiler and layer industries and the pig industry, the dairy, the beef feedlot industry, to monitor our feed grains and develop a near-infrared reflectance or NIR technology for immediate real-time scanning of feed grains to get a very comprehensive appreciation of their nutritive value. And what this table here shows is the range that has been recorded on different grains, and you can see that there can be sort of up to 4 megajoules of energy difference in a particular grain sample, just depending on where it was grown and how it was grown. Typically, wheat falls out around about the 14 megajoule mark, and in most instances, barley will be somewhere around 12.9. But in this particular year that we've just had, the grain is of such sound quality and very plump and well finished that the sort of energies we're recording at the moment are more like 13.1, 13.2 even 13.4 for some of our barleys. And in fact, when we get very good quality barley, relative to say a normal or an ordinary wheat, we can have a situation where the barley energy value is actually higher than wheat. But in most instances, there is a differential there where wheat tends to be higher than barley. Sorghum tends to be a lot more consistent in its energy value, and we see less variation there. This NIR facility, it's known as AusScan, and I think that, well, I'd recommend that you investigate any avenue you have to utilise this resource, because I think it's probably the best technological advance that we've seen in stock feed milling in the 50 odd years that I've been involved with it. And what it does is, in one single scan of the grain, we can get both the ileal and fecal digestible energy values. And this tells us a lot about where the energy is being digested. Most of the material that's digested by the end of the ileum is readily available to the animal, and most of the starch will be going up as glucose, etc. And the material that's recovered from the hindgut gives us some idea of what we're recovering by fermentation, and we can use these values to define the net energy value of that grain. It also tells us things like the fecal DE index, which is an estimate of the intake of that grain, its palatability, throughput, etc. But it also gives us the typical approximate analysis of that grain in terms of protein, moisture, fibre, fat, starch and ash, and this gives us a very good insight into the characterisation of that grain. It gives us a lot of detail about the fibre in all the different fractions, and in particular a good characterisation of these non-starch polysaccharides, the sticky compounds that occur in some grains, and it gives us an indication of what enzyme application we should be looking at to extract full value from them. From a feed milling point of view, it also gives us information about how the product will absorb water and how therefore it will pellet, what gelatinizing properties it has, and how readily enzymes can access the substrates. So when we look at different grains, grains are primarily supplying energy from the starch that they contain, and this starch is stored in different ways in different grains. How it's stored and how accessible it is can have a big effect on the availability of that starch for digestion. The more complex the structure, the more or potentially less available that starch will be, and we may need to adopt some processing differences or enzyme applications to get that full extraction. When we look at wheat, it's a very open, simple starch structure, readily accessible. When we come to barley, the starch tends to be encapsulated to a degree in things like beta-glucan, and it probably the rate of accessibility is a little less, and we just have to approach it in a slightly different manner. In terms of sorghum, the starch is encapsulated in a protein matrix called cafferin, and this is largely an indigestible protein, and we need to fine grind that sorghum to make sure we're opening up all that those starch cells to give them ready enzyme access. And also we can use, in more recent times, things like protease enzymes to start dealing with this protein to free up the starch access as well. In terms of corn, it's a hard, vitreous endosperming corn, and we need again to fine grind that corn to maximize the enzymic access to the starch to get good utilization. So what are the features of Australian barley? As Mary mentioned, it's a temperate winter crop. It's harvested in planted in about April and May. It's harvested in October and December. It's mainly the two-row varieties of barley. They're spring type, and they're primarily focused around malting characteristics. And this is the production of malt for beer or spirit production. But those same characteristics are also what determine or set the stage for good energy values in the grain for animals that consume it. It's a medium-sized grain, similar to wheat, and it's a white grain, but it has a hull as distinct from wheat or sorghum and or corn. It has a very low mycotoxin content usually. The number of companies here do monitor the mycotoxin levels in our grain, and they find in most years they are particularly low. We tend to enjoy the opportunity to harvest our grain very dry, and most of our grain would be harvested at below 12% moisture. Also, the storage facilities available in Australia here are quite outstanding, and they do tend to preserve the quality of that grain once they're harvested and stored. One aspect of barley, of course, is it doesn't have any yellow pigment. So if you're using corn in your diet at the moment with a purpose to provide some pigmentation, and you switch to using barley or a portion of barley instead, then you have to be aware of the fact that there will be no pigment contribution, and you may have to derive that from another source. They do tend to be viscous grains, and by that we mean that they do contain these soluble non-starch polysaccharides, beta-glucans, arabinoxylans, etc., which do tend to sort of cause a increase in the viscosity of gut contents, particularly in poultry, but not so much in pigs. But even so, these aspects are quite easily managed with supplementary enzymes and are really of no real concern to pigs. We get very good value out of feeding barley to pigs. In terms of energy, the energy value is less than that of corn and wheat or sorghum. It is in the lower end of the spectrum, and this is mainly due to its higher fibre content and lower starch. However, that fibre content isn't necessarily viewed as a negative aspect. It's often considered an asset in regard to maintaining good gut health in the animals. And the gut is a very critical organ for pigs. It's not only the digestive function that's involved there, but it's also the largest immune organ in the body, and it's very helpful to keep the gut healthy to maintain the general health of the animal. Protein is typically higher than that in corn, but similar or lower than that in wheat, just depending on where it's grown. It does vary quite a bit, but the protein that it does contain is certainly of high biological value, and by that we mean it has a high proportion of the essential amino acids that are necessary to meet the requirements of the animal. It's used extensively in pig diets as a safe and reliable feed component, and has a very long history both here in Australia and certainly in Northern Europe for feeding pigs. It's a robust and reliable grading system that we have here in Australia for grain trading, and so the material that you buy will have been very well described, and you can be assured that it's meeting the standards that you expect. There are anti-nutritional factors involved, and we need to be cognizant of these, and these are compounds that limit the availabilities of nutrients for digestion. These come in the form of structural ANFs or anti-nutritional factors, and the main ones of these are the non-starch polysaccharides, both their soluble and insoluble forms, and include things like xylans, beta-glucans, galactans, pectins, etc., all the sticky type compounds that may occur in grains. Other ANFs include mineral binding materials such as phytate and oxalates, and there are some others that reduce the protein digestion and utilization, things like protein inhibitors and tannins, etc. We do have the know-how to overcome most of these challenges. And in terms of tannins, protease inhibitors, oxalates, etc., these are of no consequence in barley. They don't feature at all. Most cereal grains contain phytate, and most diets today would contain a phytase to address that aspect. And similarly, the non-starch polysaccharides that occur in barley and in wheat are quite adequately addressed with the commercial enzyme products that are available today to be applied. If we look at the NSP content of the various grains, you can see here where barley does have a relatively high soluble NSP content, certainly relative to corn, and somewhat higher than wheat. and also quite a significant insoluble content. This is the part that really is health promoting, I guess, in the gut of the animal, and therefore, as I said, rather than being viewed as a negative aspect, it's probably becoming more appreciated as a positive contribution. Just to look at it pictorially, the arabinoxylans are quite common in wheat, but they're not at dissimilar level in barley, and there's also a significant amount in corn. The feature that separates barley away from these others is this red band here, which is the beta-glucan content. And as long as we're aware of that and address it appropriately, it doesn't constitute any real issue to us. More specifically, when we look into this, there is this differentiation of the NSPs into soluble and insoluble fractions. And again, when you look at the soluble xylan here, the wheat is the highest of those, and that's the main NSP that we would focus our enzyme applications for in wheat. But when we come to barley, the one that we're particularly interested in here is the soluble beta-glucan here. And as I say, it does create a difference between the grains, but it's something that is very easily managed with enzymes. The other component that we need to address, and I'd suggest there's not a broiler feed, a layer feed, or a pig feed made in Australia that doesn't include a phytase enzyme. And this is to address the fact that seeds store their phosphorus requirements primarily as phytate phosphorus. Phytate is essentially an inositol ring complex to which is added 6 units of phosphorus. When the seed starts to germinate, it tends to hydrolyze or creates a endogenous secretion of phytase, and that starts to hydrolyze and free that phosphorus up for the plant to utilize. But while it's in this storage state, it's also not only holding those phosphoruses onto that molecule, but it also tends to block or bind other materials as well, both minerals, protein, and starch. And so it can become an anti-nutritional factor by making these materials unavailable to the animal. And hence, by using phytase in the diet, and we can hydrolyze that molecule, we do break it down into inositol, free phosphorus, and free up those nutrients that were otherwise bound. And that inositol complex is quite a useful nutrient in itself, and it's very helpful in promoting gut maturation. And so what we tend to find is that phytase delivers a very good return to the investment. $1.50 added into the diet produces $8 to $10 return in terms of improved performance in the animal. So it's a bit of a no-brainer that we would include phytase in most diets. When it comes down to how much of this phytate is in the grains, you can see that in terms of barley, corn, and wheat, there's not a lot of difference in there, and that a significant proportion of the phosphorus is in that phytate-bound form, 72% in corn and wheat, and something like 60% in barley. And a very valuable resource to be released and freed up and made available to the animal, rather than to go out into the feces and become a polluting aspect in the environment. Very useful enzyme application there. So to manage these anti-nutritional factors, the primary tools we have available are these exogenous enzymes. The animal itself, unfortunately, doesn't have many of these enzymes at adequate levels to deal with the challenges. And so by providing these non-starch polysaccharides, the beta-glucanase enzymes and the xylanase enzymes in the diet, and phytase, etc., we can certainly improve the utilization of the nutrients within those grains. Sometimes we get asked, well, how much of these materials can we use in diets? And this becomes very subjective and arbitrary in terms of your own personal views and your risk management or aversion attitudes, I guess. But certainly wheat represents no real limitations. We can use it freely in all the progeny diet. We tend to be a little bit restrictive in its use in sow diets, mainly because of its readily fermentable nature. And when it's ground fine and presented in a pelleted form in particular, it has a capacity to induce ulcers or potential other gastric upsets. And so we tend to be a little bit more conservative with its use in those instances. As far as barley is concerned, we're again very generous with the grower finisher type feeds and dry sows, like 100% inclusion if we wish. We tend to limit it a little more in the lactating sows and in the younger pigs, mainly because of the fibre components may be a little bit limiting to intake. But a small amount of barley and the fibre it delivers can be very helpful in promoting gut health. In terms of sorghum, there's varying degrees of confidence about how much sorghum you can use, and it's mainly a question of palatability and the fact that when you grind it very finely to get the starch exposure, that very fineness of grind is sometimes a little bit less palatable to the pigs. Corn, of course, is very freely utilised, maybe restricted a little in the younger pig diets because of their difficulty in handling the starch components in their diets. One thing we do need to be cognizant of, though, is that when we present these materials to the pigs in their diets, they have to be processed adequately to get the full value out of them. And the digestibility of the feed components is directly related to the particle size. But defining the optimal particle size is sometimes a little bit more complicated than it first appears. It varies with the type of grain that we're utilising. It varies with the production stage of the animals that we're involved with, whether it's weaners, growers, finishers, sows, etc. And any other processes involved. If there's going to be pelleting or extrusion or liquid feeding or enzymic fermentation, etc., then that will affect what the optimum particle size will be. And it's also a question of what's the incidence and risk of gastrointestinal disturbances. What we tend to find is the finer the grind, the more the risks involved. So we would tend to opt for a slightly coarser grind if there were a history of problems in animals. Also, it costs a lot of money to grind feed very fine. So there's a balance between the milling cost relative to the benefits. And also when we grind material particularly fine, we can induce some palatability issues and depress intake. And when we have it in that fine form, it can often form physical handling difficulties in terms of bridging in silos and trucks, and also can make it a bit more difficult to apply fat to the diet. And in the feed mill or in the piggery itself, there's always this question of the levels of respirable dust that come from very finely ground material. So all these aspects come into consideration when we're determining just what level of grind size we're going to work with. But it's not only just the average particle size that we're interested in, it's also the variability of those particles. And what we tend to find here is if the particles are very uniform, that is the preferred way to have them. We tend to have less digestive upsets. We have more uniform digestion. We tend to limit particle separation in the handling of that feed, and we get better uniform mixing. If we pass the grain through a hammer mill in particular, we tend to get a bigger spectrum of particle sizes from very fine to rather coarse. And these very fine particles can create issues in that they do tend to have a faster digestion rate. They create the handling issues I just mentioned, the palatability issues, the respirable dust issues, and in fact cause gut irritation. And at the same time, these larger particles here tend to have a delayed digestion due to limited enzyme access. We've got larger or smaller surface area per unit mass here, and therefore we have these asynchrony episodes arising where the release of nutrients gets out of sync with one another and the utilization of those nutrients can be compromised. An example of how important, I guess, this grind size or particle variation can be. This is a piece of work conducted at the University of Queensland as part of the Premium Grains for Livestock program conducted by the Pork CRC here in Australia. And basically what it involved was taking a barley grain and making a mash diet and milling the barley through a 4mm screen. It created the mash, the pigs were fed on that, they grew quite respectably, growing at 800 grams a day and a feed conversion just over 2. When that same mash was pelleted, we saw an improvement here in growth rate and an improvement in feed efficiency. But of particular interest was the fact that if we then took that mash and re-sieved it to take out all the particles greater than 1700 micron, and then reground these through a 3.2mm screen and added them back into the mash, when this was fed to the animals, they actually ate less feed because they were then extracting more from the food than they were previously. They grew better and had a substantial improvement in feed conversion relative to the original mash of the order of 8%. And when this material was then pelleted, it showed no further benefits. So just getting the grind size right can be the key to getting good feed efficiency. And this is another example that I'll show you. This is a trial that I conducted myself with the Australian Pork Farms Group in over 3,000 growing finishing pigs. What we did here was just take a basic common wheat, barley, pea, canola type diet. We ground it through a disc mill and then we pelleted those diets. And the only differences that we created were that we milled some of the diets at 600 micron or some at 1200 micron. And then we created a third treatment here by blending the two together. But I won't go into a lot of detail other than to sort of show you that when you look at the grind size effects on average daily gain in the grower phase, there was very little difference. And in terms of feed efficiency, there was an improvement in feed efficiency associated with the finer grinding. In the finisher phase, again, pigs grew very well at 960 grams a day and had a feed to gain around 2.5 on the finer ground material, but drifting out to 2.6 on the coarser material. So the bottom line here is that the finer grind in this instance in terms of feed conversion didn't compromise growth rate in any way, but it did improve feed efficiency by 3% in the grower phase and nearly 6% in the finisher phase. So again, getting the grind size right is very much part of the deal. It's not just which grain you're using, but making sure that you prepare that grain in the most appropriate manner. What I've done here is I've just given you an example of how we might put different diets together with different grains. And this is using an Australian-based comparison first of all, and then we'll look at one for the Philippines. But in this instance, we could create a barley-based diet here with around 50–60% barley, using some legumes. We like to see peas. Pigs love peas. They go very well on those. Canola, meat meal, canola oil, and just other limestone, dicalphos, amino acids, etc. in a premix. Basically setting the specification here of a grower diet around 14.1 megajoules and 0.99% standard ileal digestible lysine. If we look at the wheat-based diet, a similar level of grain and similar levels of other materials, but the difference between the wheat diet and the barley diet is largely this oil content. And this extra oil here is what we use to make up the shortfall or the difference in energy between the barley and the wheat. And the same specification, and with the current sort of prices of grain in Australia, this is by far the best economic option. And there's other examples here using sorghum and or a combination, which is probably more common in Australia, is to use a combination of different grains. But the highlight here, of course, is that barley this season is priced well, it's good quality, and it's producing the most cost-effective diets. If we look at the comparison in the Philippines, I got some prices from the Philippines, and I noticed that in one particular instance there was Ukrainian wheat being utilised there. So I let that come into the equation, and I've formulated a base diet here using things like, well, a maize base, and then using wheat pollard, rice bran, soybean meal, copper, etc., coconut oil. And again, formulating a diet to the same specification. This produces a diet around that sort of cost, but it's all functional or dependent on these raw material assumptions over here. Whoops, and that can be, go back. That can be something that you may just have to adjust as you consider this sort of data. But the features I wanted to show here is if we went to a barley-based diet, in this instance here, I've used barley and some corn, mainly because the differential in price here between the barley and the corn in my example was such that it preferred to use a combination of both. But again, one of the aspects here is that the price is improved with that combination there. And also that the level of soybean meal you need is substantially less because of the quality of the protein in the barley. And with soybean at its record prices at the moment, this is quite a significant advantage to the barley as a base for the diets. And again, you could use combinations of wheat, barley, and sorghum if you wished, and that, in fact, would, in this instance, gave the cheapest feed cost in this instance. So how do we go about selecting the preferred grain base for the diets? We need to remind ourselves that the pig is a very adaptable omnivore. It can utilize a wide range of different feedstuffs very effectively. And that a megajoule of energy or a gram of standard ileal digestible lysine or other amino acids can come from any source with equal efficiency. As long as we've got that adequately described on the materials we use, we can jump and change from material to material, and the pig will adapt to it very effectively. So feed formulation is more about nutrient delivery than it is about ingredient use. They don't have to have any particular ingredients. They don't have to have corn or soy. They can get by on a mixture of many other things. And all feedstuffs have their specific properties that we need to be cognizant of when combining them with other components to make up a complete feed. It's the marriage of these materials to deliver a final product that meets the nutrient requirements of the animal. And so with a full appreciation of the available nutrient content of feedstuffs and any peculiar constraints to using them, the prime determinant becomes the relative cost of delivering those necessary nutrients. And this is why I would advocate the AusScan type facilities to identify and define those values as accurately as possible. And to be economically competitive, we need to maintain an open mind to all the options. We can't get fixated about the pigs must have this or must have that. They are very adaptable. And certainly corn and soy may be the dominant components in much of the world's pig foods, but they are not essential. They can be replaced. And so the conclusion for today's talk is that the pig has an ability to use a broad range of feedstuffs to meet its nutrient needs. And traditionally in Asia, corn has been the predominant grain employed. However, with increasing international trade and other grain alternatives, have emerged representing some real economic advantage. And Australia this year is enjoying a very productive barley harvest, and it's resulting in significant quantities being available for export at competitive prices. The domestic Australian pig industry will certainly take advantage of this big barley crop and will utilise this barley as the dominant grain in the diets this year in Australia. And this opportunity also presents itself to our near Asian neighbours, and I think it's well worth considering. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tony Edwards. That was a terrific and a solid presentation talking about the alternative feed grains for the hog industry of the Philippines. You covered off on a lot of aspects of energy, fibre, amino acids, and also the combination of different grains, and not necessarily the most economical grain provide you with the great benefits. Tony, we received a lot of questions during your presentations, but in essence of time with these webinars, and to the people that submitted your questions, we're going to hold them over and put them into the panel session, which is coming up next. So Tony is part of the panel session, but it's going to be chaired by AGIC's CEO, Mr. Richard Simonitis. So before we move in, so I just want to give you a bit of background about Richard. So Richard has a broad experience in export-focused commodities and industries, having worked in logistics and product quality roles in the iron ore industry and in senior management roles in the grains industry across logistics, operations, marketing and trading. And Richard has a very big passion for the feed grains industry of Australia, and it was one of the big drivers of we wanted to support the feed grains industry Australia and Philippines. We're really glad that you accepted us, and we've had a constant over 100 people online for this webinar, so we really hope you get some great value out of it. Now, we are running tight timeframes with these webinars, and I know time's essential. So Richard, I'm going to hand over to you to introduce the panel speakers, roll through the questions, and please stay online to submit more of your questions, listeners out there, audiences out there, and we'll follow up with a poll at the end of the session. So thanks very much, Richard, all yours.
Thanks, Mary, and thanks very much, Tony, for a very comprehensive presentation. Just for a little bit of context, AGIC has been working in the feed sector promoting Australian grains across Southeast Asia for about 5 years now. We started that seeing the huge amount of volume that was going into China and the risk that that meant for us, and we thought, well, if our feed grains can work in China, then they'll work across the rest of Southeast Asia. And let's make an investment into trying to bring the technical understanding into the market to help our customers understand the value in using these grains. So Tony's done a great job of that today. So thank you, Tony. I'll move on to introduce our other two panelists. And I'm going to have to take a deep breath, I think, to get through the bios of these two amazing people. So I'm going to go ladies first and introduce Nikki Garcia, the president of the Philippine Association of Feed Millers. So thanks for being available and joining us today, Nikki. Nikki is Executive Vice President, Treasurer and Corporate Management Services Director in the VitaRich Corporation. She directs and monitors compliance of the departments to achieve the production and quality parameters that are required. She oversees operations and their efficiency, allocates funding, negotiates commercial contracts, gets involved in procurement as well. So very hands-on in that business. Previously, Nikki was a manager at Le Pain Quotidien, an international chain of cafe-style restaurants which specialises in bakery items. So I'm very happy about that. That's a big part of our business as well, understanding the food side and how the patisserie sector can use Australian grain effectively. So Nikki has a degree in international hospitality management from what used to be the Glion Hotel School in Switzerland. So very prestigious institution there. She joined VitaRich in October 2003 and has vast experience in supply chain from all the way from the farm to the dinner plate, and has managed restaurants locally in the Philippines and overseas, and completed many of the things that you need to do to make them work, such as your supplier audits and your operational audits to improve performance. She was part of the VitaRich nutrition training team of Paul's of England, and is a third generation family member of VitaRich. or the previous company, the VitaRich, which has now become VitaRich. And she's actively involved in the expansion and growth of this company. So on top of all that, in February 2020, Nikki was elected the president of the Philippines Association of Feed Millers. So congratulations, Nikki, and thanks for joining us. Now to introduce Dr. Rommel Salabo, a past president of the Philippine Society of Animal Nutritionists. So Dr. Salabo is a professor of monogastric nutrition and the director of the Institute of Animal Science at the University of the Philippines, Los Baños. He received his bachelor's degree, did his undergrad work in animal science in the USA, South Dakota University as a Fulbright and Rebel Scholar, and then went on to do his PhD at Kansas State in swine nutrition. Then worked in his postdoctorate work with two highly respected nutrition organisations, the Kansas State Applied Swine Nutrition Team and the Handstein Monogastric Nutrition Laboratory at University of Illinois. His research and extension program focused on applied monogastric nutrition with emphasis on feed ingredient evaluation, much the same as what Tony's presented earlier. And current research includes development of dynamic approaches in estimating nutritional value of conventional food ingredients, precision feeding systems, evaluation of novel feedstuffs, and feed additive research. He's collaborated extensively with stakeholders of the livestock industry to get producers access to the latest information and to adopt what works for their operation to improve their profitability. And Rommel has received numerous national awards. I won't try and detail all of them now, but an outstanding academic career on top of the real world work that he's doing. So Rommel, thanks very much for making yourself available, and thank you for joining us today. So I think a good starting point may be just to invite our two new panelists to just offer their any comments or impressions of the message we've just heard from Tony. Would either of you like to volunteer to go first?
The academe first.
Ladies first.
Well,
Okay.
thank you, Dr. Raval. I'll go ahead.
Okay.
So the Philippine feed industry has the challenge, but I would like to take the opportunity to feed around 108 to 110 million Filipinos with a growth rate of around 1.3%. With the growing population and the growing challenges of COVID, many feed millers in the Philippines, as an integral part of the food supply chain, are looking for ways to provide sustainable food on every Filipino's plate. Just to give you a brief background of PAFMI, the association is composed of 35 members whose collective feed production accounts around 70% of the total feed market. We have been involved with the local feed sectors for around 70 years. Our members produce a wide range of feeds from poultry, aquaculture, pet food, and swine. Our vision is to provide and develop the well-being of our Philippine industry, achieving sound and harmonious business relationship amongst our manufacturers and stakeholders along the value chain. Our mission as well is to provide quality and affordable feed products to our key customers, which are the livestock, poultry, aquaculture, and other animals. Ultimately, we would like to provide safe and quality feeds, and in turn, provide safe and quality food to our end customers. Now, since it is a swine seminar, we'll focus on the swine industry. Latest available government data shows that there is around a 14% decline of swine inventory. Luzon is affected, as the data estimates that around 25% of the total inventory of population remains. to date. 2021 feed outlook tells the same story. Our overall production will be conservatively projected to drop around 20% compared to 2020, mostly due to the decline in swine feed consumption. Despite the projected drop, swine feed is positioned to be again the leading driver of our demand, locally accounting to around 40% of the market. These are our big challenges facing our industry. First would be the unprecedented increase of raw materials globally. Second would be increase of logistics. Third is ASF severely affecting our backyard sector. Again, as I mentioned before, here in Luzon. With that said, I am sure that it's just another roadblock and that we can eventually overcome together. Crucial for our recovery as an industry is the role of safe, quality, economic, viable animal feeds, of course, alongside expanded consumption and demand of our local needs. Affordable, available, and accessible feeds can encourage proper feeding, um, not encourage our customers to use swill, in growing practices locally, which in turn addresses our concerns on animal biosecurity, biosafety. Again, economic viability should always be emphasized to encourage production recovery and expansion of our local industry. Uh, in line with this, I strongly believe that we have to focus on our feed formulation in pursuing innovation. Australian barley offers us a much needed opportunity, and I look forward to our discussion regarding the matter today. And we also hope, together with Dr. Sulabo and our other panelists, that this seminar will help our swine raisers and feed mill industry stakeholders.
Thanks, Nikki. What a great overview of this state of the industry at the moment, and what a great opportunity as the recovery happens to innovate, and with those commercial drivers, as the industry recovers, we will see more industrialization and more professionalism coming in. And with that, the technical support is really important to be able to make the most of those opportunities and to be flexible and resilient and adaptable to extract full economic value. So thank you so much for that overview. And now, Dr. Rommel, I'll invite you, comments and impressions just as a starting point for the Q&A session.
Well, thank you very much, Richard, and thank you very much for the invitation to join this panel. I guess it's a good thing that Nikki started first, because she gave a very good overview of where we are in terms of both the swine and the feed industry. And I guess if you would look at the example of the Philippines, it's not unique to the Philippines, the challenges that we do have. But the challenges that we have, we always look at it also as a way to innovate and look at opportunities that could be good, not just for the livestock industry, but for the Philippines as a whole. And Tony did a very good discussion on looking at the value of barley. And for us as animal nutritionists, and I guess I would represent two organizations today, that would be PhilSan as well as the academe. One of the most important values that we need is flexibility. And whenever we have opportunities to increase the profile of ingredients that we can use in the diets and look at opportunities to reduce costs, that will always be advantageous at the end for our farmers. And so I really look forward to our discussion today.
Thank you, Ronald. Definitely aligning the message there with what Tony had to say. So we've had some really good questions come through on the Q&A facility. So I might just go through some of those. A couple of them are directed directly to Tony. So I might start with those. Tony, about a quarter of the way into your presentation, you made the point that there can be some variability in energy due to agronomic issues.
Yes.
And the question we've had is, does that apply equally for corn as it does for the Australian grains that you spoke about?
Yes, probably to a lesser extent, in as much that corn tends to be grown probably in more reliable rainfall areas or is irrigated, and therefore the growth and yields tend to be more consistent. But all those conditions, your fertilizer use, your crop diseases, etc., mold infestation, etc., all have an effect on overall grain quality. So yes, I don't think you can assume that all corn is corn or all wheat or barley is barley. You need to look at each load of materials and assess it for those particular qualities. But Australia is quite a diverse growing scene, in as much that, as Mary mentioned, the country is 4,000 kilometres across and 3,000 kilometres deep, and the variation of conditions in those growing can vary quite a bit. And if the grain does get starved for water, or gets frosted, or hail damage, or some other problem with it, then there can be compromises to quality. But the strict grading system that operates in Australia will identify that and classify those materials into their appropriate categories, so that when you go to buy a material, you're buying it to a quality standard, and you can define what that is. A lot of those other lower materials will come available, of course, at a lower price, and when you assess the nutrient content in them relative to the price, you can make a judgment as to whether it has value for you or not.
And our advice would always be to get to know your supplier well and be very specific about your requirements. So with barley, you could manage that by specifying hectolitre weight and maximum screenings, for example, which would guarantee that you're getting good value for the dollar. Ronald, did you want to add something there? I saw you were quite engaged in the answer.
Yes, well, if there is anything constant with feed ingredients, that is variability. And I think we have a false notion that corn is not a variable ingredient. And I mean, we're just looking at the work we're doing here with our grains, we see the same variation. So it's just a matter of how we mitigate the effect of variability. And Tony mentioned a few things. I think we are now in a day and age that allows us to mitigate that variability using technologies like NIR. If we do have those calibration models, I think it will not be as big as an issue. So I just wanted to make that point.
Okay, thanks, Rommel. Another question that came through, and maybe you've touched on this one already, Tony, but for barley, the question is, do we need to use xylanase in addition to beta-glucanase to extract the full value?
I believe we do. There's a similar level of xylanase often in barley as there is in wheat. It's an insurance factor, really. It's something that we, unless you go to a lot of trouble, you don't necessarily monitor. And what we tend to say, or the approach we take in Australia, is that if we apply the enzymes across the board, then with a very sound grain with low NSP, you don't get so much of a response. But in those grains that do have a high NSP or are responsive, you get a very good response. And what it tends to do is not necessarily make all grains that much better, but what it tends to do is even out the variation, so that the lesser grains come up to be normal, and the normal grains, don't respond greatly. The good grains don't respond much more for the enzyme, but you get a lot more consistency in the performance of your livestock by taking that insurance of having those enzymes in the feed.
Yes. risk management and maximising efficiency. A third question was just a quick one because we didn't touch on it. Just if you had at hand upper formulation limit for oats.
Oats. Yes, where we, oats rarely feature in swine diets in Australia unless they're very plentiful or cheap. They tend to be more used in ruminant or horse diets than pigs. But no, look, we're quite happy, particularly in things like finisher feed and dry sow feed. We would use 20 to 30% oats quite comfortably. And in particular, if you dehull the oats to form groats, that's probably the best grain base you can have for young piglets.
Yes.
Porridge oats is marvelous. It's really, it's about as good as it gets. But whole oats themselves are about 40% hull. And so there's a lot of fiber in whole oats. And so they have limited application in young pig diets in that form. But once you've dehulled them, they are top of the tree. They're right up there with corn and rice in terms of their energy value, and have a lot of other useful aspects as well.
So I saw both Rommel and Nikki nodding their heads vigorously there. I'll invite you both to comment. Maybe Rommel, because you're off mute.
Well, oats is not it's not a material that's available in the Philippines, but I would agree with Tony specifically on the use of oat groats in nursery diets. Actually, that is actually a very good ingredient for piglet feed. So if it is available, then that can certainly something that can be used.
And Nikki, thanks, Rommel. Nikki, did you want to add?
Well, I think there was a time that oats was actually affordable economically, but it was a short time though. A couple of years ago, when I first entered Vitarich, we used oats quite a bit. And it did give itself a high digestibility for piglet diets. But later on, I think the price shoot up at around 20%.
And you're right. And part of the driver for that is that over the last 10 years, oats has pretty much become a human food in Australia more than an animal feed. And the pricing has followed that. So for those that are interested, some of the work you'll see on our website has been around innovation with oats, and we've made an oat rice product from a pearled groat and a ramen style oat noodle, 100% whole grain noodles. So these are products that we'll be trying to get into the Asian market very soon. And I guess we must be a fair bit like a pig on the inside because they're very good food for humans as well. So we've seen that shift in the Australian market. So another question that's directed towards AGIC is, will the supply of barley from Australia to Philippines be consistent, or is it just a phase due to the trade issues between Australia and China? So I think the answer to that lies in the numbers. Australia is a reliable producer of between 9 and 11 million tonnes of feed barley, and our domestic use is about 3. I think we peaked our exports into China at about 3.5. So once you take off the domestic use, we've got somewhere between around 6 million tonnes to sell every year. And just to give you an example, there's close to 2 million tonnes has gone into Saudi already this year at very low prices. So even with China back in the market, we're doing close to 1 million tonnes a year into Thailand now. That's a recent event over the last 3 years. And we think the export availability will be consistent. There's plenty of barley to go around. Some other questions, Tony, the shadow pricing that you showed, I think we've probably covered. The question is, for computing shadow price for barley versus wheat and corn, what can you recommend and how should it be computed? I think you sort of covered that at an appropriate level in the presentation. Maybe we could invite that attendee to make contact directly after the event for a more detailed answer, perhaps.
Certainly.
This one might be for Nikki. Can you comment on the starch content of barley and its impact to pellet quality in comparison with wheat? So binding ability, I guess, is where that's coming to. And other guys chime in as you like.
I think in terms of just in my short experience with barley, it's the same. It's 1:1 in terms of the gelatinization
Yeah.
and pellet binding concept. That's from our experience.
Mm-hmm. Anything else to add there, Tony or Rommel?
I would just add, yeah, there are differences in starch content. You know, the wheat's probably closer to sort of 65% starch, and the barley's more like 55% starch. But even so, you know, we do favour or promote wheat, I guess, as a good binding agent. It has the starch and it has the glutinous type fractions in there that do make a good pellet. But we make very good pellets with barley-based diet as well. So, I mean, it's just a question of, this is when you come back to the feed milling technology and saying, well, when there's a bit of a challenge there, you adjust your parameters in terms of your steam and your throughput and your cooling and other conditions to get it to work. But certainly, I think barley's probably easier to pellet than corn. And so, you know, it's, it doesn't represent a major headache to us to make barley-based diets.
I'd just like to add that the gelatinization temperature for barley is similar to wheat, and corn has higher gelatinization temperature. So, so that would tell us that the characteristics of barley when we pellet it would be much more similar to wheat than in corn. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. There's another question here. Someone joined a little bit late and their question was whether Tony spoke about a formulation or broiler trials using barley. The answer is that he didn't, but I can say hot off the press that on the 3rd of March, we'll have Tony starring again at the AGIC Asia conference. And that content will be in using barley for broiler diets, broilers and layers, and with an Indonesian focus. So I think it's hopefully near enough that you'll get value out of chiming into that one if you like. So we can share the registration details with this attendee list for the 3rd of March if people would like to join that, and it'll be available in Bahasa and in English. Another question here is the standard feed reference in Philippines states maximum inclusion for barley is only 30%, whereas we're saying 100. So maybe Rommel, you might be able to explain the difference in the detail there, perhaps.
Well, the Philippine Feed Reference Standards is published by PhilSan, the Philippine Society of Animal Nutritionists, and the last edition was a little over 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And so and it is actually currently being revised. But I would guess that the committee that decided on that, the major limitation then was availability and price. So I think that is the reason why the recommendation is lower than what would be expected. But as Tony mentioned, barley is an excellent grain, and it's just a matter of knowing its characteristics, how you value the energy, the higher amino acid, digestible amino acid concentration, the higher digestible phosphorus concentration in the material. And so with that knowledge, it's not going to be very easy to utilize it as a material. So it just have to be a function of price and availability in the market.
Yes. So there's actually a question picking up that last point. How sustainable will it be for the Philippine market to change formulation to diets including barley? Obviously, it'll take some time for acceptance, and is Australia able to sustain this with reasonable pricing? And I think the answer to that message was very strong in Tony's presentation, that it's about being flexible and taking advantage of when the pricing does work, not, creating a new formula and sticking with that. We're nearly out of time. A couple of questions probably for Nikki again. I'll wrap these two together and thank you for the questions. What are the ideal storage conditions for barley? And what is the shelf life of barley, I'm guessing, in storage? So bearing in mind that it's a dry grain, going into a tropical climate, what experience do we have there?
In terms of storing, the Philippine market stores, I guess, their grains two ways, either in a flat warehouse bagged in 50 kilos, and you have the bigger players which have silos. I believe that as long as it can store wheat, it's the same operation to store barley. It's the same goes with bagging it. So if you do have, let's say, a warehouse ISO process internally or system, you need not change the system. You just, use whatever you use for wheat and change it to barley.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I agree 100%.
As long as it arrives below 13. I think above 13 we'll have a problem there. But I think Mary was kind enough to mention that you guys will be delivering by 9 to 12%. So I think with that.
Did you want to add something there, Rommel?
Yeah, I would agree. Barley is similar in size and shape as wheat. So our experience with using wheat and storing wheat in the diet, storing wheat would be the same as barley. So I think there will not be a major adjustment.
Yeah, and definitely the experience in Australia is that holding it below 12% moisture, it'll be very safe across a wide range of temperature. Once it gets above 15%, then we start to have some problems and wants to try to grow as it gets hotter. So I think we have been through all of the questions. I might just invite our panelists to have a final comment. Nikki, would you like to just wrap up your thoughts at the end of the session for us, please?
Yeah, I'd like to encourage all the participants here to really take into consideration using barley, as we know that the global prices of soybean meal, wheat, and corn globally is going up. And unfortunately, our final consumers, which are the Filipino consumers, don't have the flexibility to adapt the higher prices of food. So I think it's in turn in our part to find flexibility. Like they said, there is finite grains in this world, but there is infinite innovation. And I would like to appeal to, I guess, a lot of the formulators, nutritionists, and feed production to really collaborate with each other and move ways to move forward. Because what I notice when you run a feed mill, we can't work in silos with your nutritionist and your formulator and your feed production. In order for new grains to work they have to all three work together side by side with the objective of making feeds economical to the market.
Yeah. Well, I just again want to emphasize that as what Tony said, pigs do not require specific feed
Yeah.
ingredients. What they need are
Yeah.
nutrients. So again, it's just a matter of understanding the characteristic of the material. And me personally, I always value looking at cereal grains because again, we have to remember that half of the cost of our diets is the energy is the cereal, and 80% of our direct material cost is just to meet the dietary energy requirement of the pig. And so whenever we look at sources of energy, it's always nice to have flexibility. So when we look at prices of wheat, I think it would be nice to see if barley would be competitive, and that would give us flexibility so that we can reduce the cost of the diet. And I think that is an exercise that we have to continue. So thank you.
Thanks, Rommel. There is a couple of late questions. One is asking about classification. Can we classify it like rice, empty kernels, broken kernels? I'll just ask that person to make contact with AGIC after the webinar, and we can provide some information about that. It is slightly different, but very similar principles. And of course, the best thing is to have a great relationship with your supplier out of Australia and have these sort of conversations with them. Final question, this one's directly to you, Dr. Rommel. If I currently use a corn-soy diet, will barley be able to replace the corn 100%? What are the effects? ? Diarrhea. I guess this is the slippery gut.
As was mentioned, barley is an excellent grain, and again, you can utilize it in the diet 100%, same as with sorghum, or same as in wheat. So again, it's just a matter of knowing how we can value the material. Actually, if the issue is diarrhea, actually that should be the opposite. You know, the fiber in maybe it's some differences between swine and poultry, but in pigs that will not really be an issue. In fact, the fiber that's present in barley can have some functional benefits, and so you can be confident that barley can be a material that can be considered as a cereal grain or carbohydrate source in the diet.
Fantastic. Thanks, Rommel. Tony, great presentation, mate. Thanks so much. Very thorough. And I'm well impressed, and I hope our friends and customers in the Philippines are as well. So thank you, sir, and we'll be in touch with you about some more work over the next few weeks for sure. Rommel, thank you, sir. Really appreciate your contribution. Nikki, thank you, miss. Really appreciate you being a fantastic addition to our Q&A panel. I'll hand back to Mary to wrap up and to get the details of the survey out for us. So thanks, Mary. Thank you, Rommel. Thank you, Nikki. Thank you, Tony.
Thank you, Richard. And I can't endorse Richard's comments about having Madam Nikki and Dr. Rommel come on and be part of our panel session today. Your insights have provided valuable knowledge for our listeners out there. And we're really pleased with how the webinar has gone so far and the amount of audience interaction and questions. So before I close out, I'd also again like to acknowledge Austrade for their assistance today. I'd also like to acknowledge DSM, Philippines and APAC, and also in Australia for their support. Nikki, a great attribute to our webinar. We're really glad that you came on. We hope to see more of you. Likewise, Dr. Romel, thank you again for your time and representing and being a past president of the Philippine Society of Nutrition, and also to Tony Edwards. And now in closing, we know that hogs are very adaptable for feed grains, and feed grain industry is very competitive. And as you all said, we need to encourage looking at flexibility in our feed grain rations for hogs into the Philippines. And Nikki, you also said working as an industry to inform one another to gain greater knowledge and maximise your knowledge and value out of the product will help the whole of the industry as the feed industry industrialises forward. So, without any further ado, I'd really like to thank you again for everybody that's come online. We know we've gone over time, but the question session for the panel is really important and it's integral. So we hope you gain value out of it. Again, at the end of this presentation, there is a poll. We'd really like you to populate the poll survey so that we can gauge the performance of this webinar and hopefully as a look forward to doing some more engagements into the future. And as Richard said, we have got some feed grain sessions coming up with AGIC Asia on what date, Richard? Was that Wednesday, the 3rd of March, 2021? So and to everybody that's registered online today, we'll actually send you out the link so you can have a look at that again. But all in all, again, thank you very much, Philippines, for your support in today's events, and also to the Australian grains industry. I'd like